Hello. Okay, welcome to Temple University Japan campus. I'm Robert Dujarric from the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. We're extremely happy to our friend Alessio for an encore performance, and he's our first speaker of the season. So it's a great honor for us to have him, and I know you will be the first and the best presenter of the year. Just a few things. If you didn't get an email directly for this session and would like to be on our mailing list, you can give us your business card here in the box, or you can give it to me. And also, if you wish to make a contribution to the Institute to make these events possible, we have our ballot box that accepts ballots and money, with a strong preference for money. I think once we got a total of 348 yen, so we're sure we'll break the 350 barrier this time, thanks to Alessio's popularity. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Alessio, who will enlighten us for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have an hour of Q&A. Thanks again, Alessio.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for having me here tonight again. There's two things I probably have to say before I even start. For many years, I've come to Japan and I was giving talks, and as those of you who know me a little bit better, they're familiar with the idea that most of the time I was talking about Japan, I was talking about Japanese naval and maritime heritage or security-related issues, but in the maritime realm. And for many years, it was like the US Marine Corps, the few, the proud. Last year, for the first time, I had this insane idea to expand the area of research to include China and start looking at Sino-Japanese maritime relations in a wider sense in East China Sea. And I thought that was a brilliant idea, because the day that we had the seminar here, there was pretty much roughly about 40 to 50 people. So it was like twice as many people as I had ever experienced. So I thought, like, yeah, cool. That is going to be like the topic of the year. Come back here again, and it's twice the size of last time. So that for me is guaranteed the fact that I'm not dropping this one for quite some time. It seems to be an excellent current maker, but it puts also a lot of pressure on the presenter. The second thing I want to say, I must apologize, because the title is misleading. If you were expecting me to start talking about, getting ready for war, I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint you. The aim of the talk is probably going somewhere else. However, the 17th of September is nearby, and those of you who are familiar with history know that that picture refers to that particular date back in 1894. What is my talk about then today? Today I'll try to take a step back from current affairs and the emphasis on talking about one particular aspect of the engagement between China and Japan in the maritime realm, the one concerning territorial disputes they have. I'll take a step back and ask the question, a very fundamental question really: what is the role of this China Sea in the evolving Chinese and Japanese strategies? And this is a very important question, because we cannot understand, we cannot isolate the context of the territorial disputes from the wider meaning and strategic significance of this environment to the two countries. And this is important also for another reason. One of the key arguments that I set forth here is that a maritime system, and I'll come back to this point and explain better what I mean by maritime theatre, maritime system, is one in which the water, the sea, is the primary, the main connecting fabric at the structural level. It's a fundamental structural feature. And it's very different, because the sea has different attributes and has therefore different implications in terms of strategy. First of all, the sea cannot be physically occupied in the same way land is. Now that sounds a silly and almost common sense, but in the realm of strategy it makes a huge difference. It means that you cannot draw a line, build up a wall, put a fence, and put lots of people on both sides. That is never going to happen. Mind you, when you have lots of people with lots of rifles, lots of artillery ammunition, lots of things around on two sides of the same fence, that is a lot different than the maritime environment. The maritime environment is, its main characteristic really revolves around the fact that this is by far the single largest connecting fabric in the world. It is like a huge highway. It promotes access and mobility. Even deep into landlocked countries like Afghanistan, the first shots were driven from the sea, were Tomahawk, they were launched from the Indian Ocean. So one of the preliminary considerations, one of the first things I'll look at really is, what is the meaning? What does it mean? And the framework I'm going to use is one that for many, many years concerned the studies, the field of strategic studies that concerns with problems of sea power. Now, the one thing, I'll take the suspense away. Operating the maritime realm at the strategic level, it provides one thing that most of the time you don't have on land, and that is strategic flexibility. By this I mean the possibility to empower political elites with a number of different options. In a situation where at sea you find two ships standing not far away, one from the other, you always have the possibility to back down. That is an important difference. At the same time, I think it is probably now the case to talk a little bit more about the attributes of the sea. What do I mean by access, mobility? What is the meaning of this highway? Well, there are three main features that concern the sea. First of all, it is a medium of transportation by far, and the majority of goods in the world are transported at sea. We might live in a virtual age where everything is 2 clicks away, but between the 2 clicks and the materializing physically, or whatever it is that you reach 2 clicks away from where you are physically, there's probably going to be quite a few movement here and there, and all of them will happen most of the time in containers that are shipped at sea. I'll come back to this point in a moment. It is also a space that facilitates in this respect the spread of ideas, economic interactions, but also a realm to exercise dominion. A realm from where dominion, power was exercised and power was projected. So it is intrinsic into the very nature of the sea to contain elements both of cooperation, if you want, and competition. When we talk about sea power, in sort of like in the parlance of those who work in this field, usually we connect in terms of the strategic level, in terms of what are the strategic implications of what I've just said. A means of transportation, a means of communication at the same time, means for the exercise of power. Well, it has three main implications. First, as a realm in its own terms, as a means of transportation, it has one fundamental crucial function. It enables primary resources, raw materials, to travel across the globe. Take, for example, a country like Japan. A country like Japan, even today, still relies 90% for its own survival on things that are either sent from this country somewhere else through ships or brought in through ships in this country. But there's also another meaning of this. As a resource, and therefore not just as a medium that transports resources, the sea also has resources inside. It offers the seabed, so the seabed that lies beneath waters can offer, both in terms of fish stocks as well as raw materials, the possibility to provide resources to begin with. As a means of communication, again, central to this idea in a wider sense is the idea of trade, commerce. Whereas when we talk about the projection of power, we're really connected back to the ability of any given country, the moment it engages with the maritime realm, and what are its aims in order to exert a degree of political influence, which could be by means of, war, or some sort of a diplomatic action, whether coercive or not, as well as policing. Some of you might have heard this before, but I always like to use this small little example to give you an idea of how that translates into practical terms. How many of you have ever been on a at a party organized on the back of a tank? Not that many. Even people carrier is, it gets really tight to have a party in there. And how many of you have ever been on a party, on the back of a air transport? Again. Yeah, all right, okay, yes. My wife does that too from time to time, but that's more Air Force sort of stuff, right? It gets a little bit sort of complicated. How many of you have ever been on the back of a ship to have a party? That's a hell of a lot more fun, isn't it? And that strikes to the heart of what I'm trying to say here. A warship, a naval platform, has a fundamental structural difference. It's a place where people both live and work at the same time for a sustained period of time. That it means that as a platform, you can use it for many things. You can use it for diplomacy, you can use it for policing activity, you can use it for war, and because the high seas are free, they aren't owned by anybody, you can park your ship outside the country's home waters. Nobody's going to tell you anything. But hell is going to send a very, very important message. Or depending on the type of ship, anyway. So this is the sort of framework I'd like to keep in mind. I'd like you to keep in mind when we talk about this. Because when it comes down to Japan and China, I think, it is very important to make one primary consideration. That Sino-Japanese relations have always been characterized, or the sea has always played a crucial function in Sino-Japanese relations, whether from the point of security as well as in a wider sense. And that we must sort of keep it in mind. Because my impression is that what we're talking about a maritime theatre. Maritime theatre, therefore, can be used for at least three things. Militarily, if we start from the last one that I had on the previous slide, sea control is the ability to control that space and to use it for whatever it is that you want to do it by preventing at the same time whoever is your potential competitor to do so. Project power, and again, as a staging platform to influence events ashore. That's an important point because if we want to understand the politics, people sometimes when I go around, people start saying, I'm a sort of like big navalist, full stop. It's not just because I come from a place that is nearby the sea. I don't forget that people live on land, so whatever it is the importance of sea power, it is about the impact it has on land. The relationship between the sea is not about, here I'm not talking about, how cool the sea is as opposed to boring land, let's get trenches and stuff. I've got plenty of friends who work in sort of World War I scenario, a Western Front sort of thing. So those of you who are familiar with the context will understand what I'm trying to say here. But the point is that it is this underlying connection that has to be considered. The sea is important insofar as it affects events on land. And this last component, if you remember what I was saying earlier on, sort of policing non-military constabulary activities depending on the vocabulary you use, this is perhaps the latest addition to the uses of sea power, which has a lot to do with the sort of like normative development over the past 3 decades, in particular as since UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, was introduced. That brought about a whole new series of considerations about the sea. So when I was talking about a maritime system, well, my idea in this respect draws upon what French historian Fernand Braudel used as the main framework for his analysis of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Fernand Braudel worked most of his life around the sort of the history of the Mediterranean Sea and of the communities that lived around it and how they interacted, how that fabric meant that both cooperation, competition, cultural communication and exchanges happened. But towards the end of his career, he actually went back to these concepts, and he tried to see whether it could apply to other places as well. And it is interesting that he definitely looked at the South and East China Seas, and his point was exactly this one, in a way that is not too dissimilar from the Mediterranean. This part of the world too was distinguished by continuous contacts between Korea, Japan, coast of China, in terms of economy, cultural, and as a result of all of this, also attempts to project power, so to speak, across time. Documentation and archaeology tells us that you can go back as far as to the Yayoi period in Japanese history to have proof, evidence of cultural and economic influence from mainland China in the Ryukyu Islands as well as in Japan, as well as sort of like economic interactions among components of the coasts in all the three countries. As a matter of fact, as a counter-argument to this, you could say that the proliferation, the existence of piracy, mind you, piracy exists so long as soon as you've got a little bit of economic interaction at sea, you pretty much, you know, wait and see, and pirates will show up shortly after. That's an economic opportunity. Okay, so, well, do we have a panel or something that shows up? Is it like 10 minutes, 5 minutes? I'm gonna kill you. You know, that sort of thing. Yeah, cool. If anyone can take on that charge, then we could go faster. Insofar as East Asia is concerned, I don't need to remind you that I'll just give you two data, which I think are very symptomatic. In terms of the 5 top world shipping routes are moving towards East Asia in 2010. In 2011, 7 of the top 10 ports in the world in terms of number of millions of containers moving were in East Asia. Mind you, the first 2 in that list were Dubai and Rotterdam, and the 29.07 million is what just, I think, Shanghai was handling, which is about, well, combined together, Rotterdam and Dubai reach about 1/3 of that number. So that's to give you an order of scale in terms of like how important the maritime realm is to the economic survivability and development of this part of the world. And of course, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan are at the very heart of these equations. Now, insofar as this China Sea is concerned, and by the way, the picture that you have here is one of these pictures that shows the movement, the movement of ships at sea. That's why it's colored in a weird way. It's not me drawing with a coral draw. It's just like the tracks left by shipping. And as you can see, it's very intense, it's very densely colored. That's the point to make. Now, on the back of this, over the past 40 years, since the early 70s, in particular in the East China Sea, which is considered to be rich also in primary resources itself, there's been an intense sort of attempt to investigate, explore, ascertain what type of natural resources are available in this area, particularly around the Senkaku. It is said to be a place where considerable amount of primary resources can be accessed or would be existing. The estimates, however, depending on Chinese, Japanese or Korean sources, tend to vary a lot. If you want to know more about data, I'm happy to talk about it later. Now, this brings us to the other dimension I was talking about, because until very recently, until the implementation of UNCLOS, there was no real sense of who owned what. UNCLOS really brought about some sort of a major revolution, creating a normative framework that was then used to start settling disputes in terms of division of borders. As you can see, this part of the world, for a whole host of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later in the question answer, came later. Now, this is something that was on the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, I think, and it just gives an idea of the existing disputes, the number of existing disputes, and as you can see, the most intense one are those connecting, China, Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Now, The fundamental point to make about this, that insofar as the disputes between Japan and China are concerned, there's two different disputes. We should never forget that it's not just about the status of the Senkaku Diaodao Island, but it is about also the delimitation of the maritime border between China and Japan. The former, while it has a very much of a political nature, because it concerns the possession of territory. Now, sovereignty is one of the last standing serious activities that belong to a state actor in terms of providing assistance to. So there is an element that very much of a political component to the question of ownership of a particular piece of land, even at sea. Whereas the question of the maritime boundaries, we probably have forgotten it, but while it's been complex and difficult for the two governments to approach, as a matter of fact, it is also the area where, without necessarily taking steps to find a solution to the division of the borders, the two countries, particularly the latest one was in 2008, agreed to cooperate in order to try to access and investigate and then exploit resources that were considered to be in the disputed areas. The main point being that at sea, in this sort of context, because of the nature and the history behind the evolution of the process of delimiting borders, this is not a zero-sum game, and there is a way for the two parties to find a compromise and therefore settle, even without reaching an agreement on where to draw the line. And that is a very important distinction. The same cannot be said for the mere possession of the Senkaku, the Diaodao. However, because they sit next to our important area, that brings about also incidentally a question about the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone that would be applied, unfolded from the possession of the islands. Key element in this story, in this particular corner of the story, from my point of view, is that there are examples of cooperation or attempted cooperation between China and Japan at sea because of the fluid nature. And because of the fact that even without settling the border dispute, you could actually have economic benefits that can be taken by both countries. Slightly different is the question that concerns the ownership of the islands themselves. So let's go to the crunchy stuff. Here there is a very simple idea that I want to share with you. Now, up until 30 years ago, pretty much really, the Chinese Navy almost didn't exist. It was a very ancillary small component. Mind you, again, a funny example, but that is very telling. No navy likes to be compared to any other components of the armed forces. Imagine if you called the People's Liberation Army Navy. That isn't really pleasant. And for many, many years, when you were raising through the ranks of the PLA, you'd be a general or senior colonel, and then at some point, you'd be given a different hat, different collar, and you become an admiral or something else. The main point being that during the second half of the Cold War, actually until the end of the Cold War, really, the main function of the PLA-Yan was primarily to provide the straits defense, here, here, and here, Taiwan, Bohai, and down around Hainan. In particular, the component of the Navy that received the sort of like the strongest contribution was the one that was east and north, because of Taiwan, first of all, but also because the Chinese expected what NATO would have called in Europe as the southern flank sort of strategy. The Soviet, rushing through the border, remember that they had a little bit of a dispute, a little bit of a fist fight down with the Soviets at some point, and the assumption was that the Navy would provide protection against any sort of like outflanking maneuver that the Soviets might conduct. Mind you, if you're familiar with Chinese geography, if you enter through the North Sea there and you land, you go one straight road into Beijing. There's nothing really between you and there, really, you get straight into there. So that was really the protection from any sort of flanking maneuver that the Soviet might conduct was essential, was the main task. This all changed at the beginning of the 90s, although there is dispute about the fact that in particular the appointment at the Central Military Committee of Admiral Yu Huaqing, many consider it like a sort of Groshkov of the Chinese Navy, there is dispute whether there was a willing attempt to give the Navy a greater status, or more, because Liu Huaqing was, very good friends with Deng Xiaoping. It was more a question of creating political sort of continuity in the political relationship between the party and the military. The fundamental point is that over the last 2 decades and a half, because of the transformation of the Chinese economy, the sort of like the position of the Navy changed within the military establishment. And even in the public arenas today, maritime questions are central to the Chinese debate about national security. Within this context, however, one should probably spend a moment about what is the main activity, the main area of operation. Now remember, when I say that operating at sea is slightly different from operating on land, one of the critical components from my point of view of what is happening in the sort of maritime empowerment of China is the incredible expansion, or currently the very important sort of competition that exists between the PLAN, whose roles and missions are still fluid and debated, and those of what is known in the sort of common parlance as the 5 dragons, the 5 small organizations with constabulary stroke paramilitary functions who cover different elements connected to this question of good order at sea and all the sort of like management activities that unfold from UNCLOS. Now, the data that you see there is on top. This is all the branches of the sort of the 5 organization. Approximately, they put together about 1,470 vessels of different nature, of which 41 goes above 1,000 tons. That's from data from the PLA daily. Then real data might be very different. God knows. The other that you see there, this is about the equivalent in Japan. The Japanese Coast Guard and the Fishery Agency have a total together of about roughly a little less than 500 units, but when you compare in terms of vessels that go above the 1,000 tons, you can see that the balance is slightly different. Mind you, both countries and the organizations in both countries have a hell of a lot of an area to control in terms of sort of like Coast Guard related duties. And one of the key questions, and it's a question I don't have an answer, and I don't think anybody has provided sufficient evidence to have a definitive answer, is the extent to which these organizations are fully under sort of a centralized control the way the military is. That is, I think that is very much of an open question. I'm happy to debate this with you later on. To draw things together, the East China Sea, insofar as China is concerned, it was primarily a sort of like a perimeter to defend. It was a place where they were trying to prevent something from happening until the end of the Cold War. And it is only as a result of the enormous expansion at the economic level of China, its increased economic needs, that the maritime realm as a whole increased its importance in China's national strategy. The extent to which there is a one unified, coordinated strategic action in the maritime realm from China, that I think is very much of an open question, with all the consequences that go with it. But what about Japan? Japan is slightly different because this China Sea and the sort of like the approach to this China Sea goes back a long way back. I mean, if you really want to be picky, we could start talking about the Imperial Navy, but please let's not do that right now because otherwise we're never going to get out of here. I like that team very much, so that's the reason. But in sticking to post-war history, I think that the first time that it appeared in the official Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, I'd call it just Japanese Navy for the sake of the discussion, otherwise I won't be able to use my time. Officially they introduced debate, or they starting expanding, considering the East China Sea as a primary maritime theatre in the second half of the 60s. As of 1966-67, this was the first time that in the Japanese naval doctrine and parlance, the idea of escorting convoys along 500 nautical miles starting from Japanese home waters towards the 2 main shipping routes, the southeast route and the southwest route, were effectively introduced and were incorporated into the missions of the Japanese Navy. And this remained a substantial sort of component of Japanese maritime strategy until very much the end of the Cold War, with some important caveats to make. The two main components of this strategy were, on one hand, escorts, convoy escorts to protect shipping as it approached Japan, and the second component was straight defense, so to speak, based on a combination of mining activities, submarine patrolling, and air patrol. Whereas the main component of the surface fleet would have been deployed in order to provide that sort of like a convoy escort coverage. Either in a passive way, as a convoy escort, by grouping, in case of war, grouping ships together, groups of 50, and then escorting them, or in an active sort of tactical approach, by going out there, hunting down whatever Soviet submarine was coming at you. The main principle being that this would have been the only thing that was not covered by the US-Japan Security Alliance within Article 5, and therefore, and that was sort of like the raiding activities of the Soviet against Japanese shipping. It was very much sort of an asymmetrical approach, and the Japanese knew that because, you know, if you don't want to starve in this country, you really have to take care of maritime shipping. That was one of the key components that was assigned to the Navy, and it became also one of the sort of underpinning core both of the US-Japan alliance, because by protecting their own interests, effectively they were bottling up the Soviet Union in the Western Pacific, serving also American global strategy. At the same time, it was also the most likely of all the scenarios. The other one being a potential invasion of Hokkaido, which by the second half of the 70s, very few really, I mean, outside the Japanese ground self-defense forces, believed it would happen. And if it were to happen, it would be primarily so to take control of the bases up here in the north, so that the Soviet could operate from their two bases, their naval assets, with greater freedom. I know. How has a Japanese strategy evolved in this respect? I think one of the key elements in the story is, after a period of about a decade of transformation and disorientation, at the beginning of the 2000s, and definitely since 2007, the approach of the Japanese strategic thinkers, especially in the maritime realm, to the problem of the East China Sea is not just about the defense of offshore islands of the archipelago. It changed in a way that it moved away from the strictly speaking sort of like a sea lane centered approach that it had during the Cold War, and it shifted to an area defense approach. Because of course the missions they're going to be running in peacetime are definitely a lot more complex than they used to be. It is first of all no longer the Cold War, so it is not just about neutralizing the archy enemy that everybody has. It is about also monitoring the situation, preventing the situation from escalating, from slipping out of hand. And even so, some of the logic that, because of geography entailed, some of the main logic still applied. Mostly what happened was a shift of attention from the northeast to the southwest, with the main sort of line, the key area, what it is called the TGT, or Admiral Takei is one of the main Japanese military strategist in the Navy, called the Tokyo, Guam, Taipei area, the space where they will have to provide a form of sea control if necessary in case of escalating crisis, or at the very least of constant monitoring and patrolling, sort of like a battle space awareness. Again, for the Japanese, the key element of the story here is not so much as insofar as the sort of the territorial disputes and the borders disputes are concerned. It's not so much about the possession or the delimitation. The strategic debate within Japanese naval thinkers is very much about a question of survival. It's not the framework they use is not one about what it is mine and what it is yours. It is about the survival of the country. Therefore, there's a much wider, broader sort of approach to this. So what are the sort of like overall conclusions? And I put them there like this, so that then we can have a discussion and go into greater detail for each one of them. And by the way, by all means, do feel free to come back with questions concerning Chinese militarization or modern military modernization process in greater detail, as well as Japanese. I mean, don't be afraid to go down into the platform discussion, because you know, that's not a problem. I think when we talk about, if we are looking at the situation from a wider perspective, so if we take a step back from the current affairs, sort of heated debate, there's four main conclusions I think that can be set forth. First of all, there is a fundamental relationship that connects the maritime nature of the geography of Northeast Asia and all sorts of discussions that we might have about Sino-Japanese security relations. The two cannot be disentangled, because the maritime realm is the connecting fabric. They sort of draws these two countries together, and so if we take that point on board, then we have to consider how in the realm of strategy, when national planners and military partners look at this area, they have a multi-layered complex picture. So the question is, what element of this picture they are prioritizing? Unfolding from this, I think that the observation, the second observation, is the one that concerns the fundamental disagreement that the two countries have over the Senkaku Jiaodai Islands. Two governments, the two countries' authorities simply do not agree over whose piece of territory that is. But that kind of agreement is very much about political negotiation. And at this particular point in time, because of the political transition that both countries, as well as Korea, Taiwan, and the United States, they all kind of 2012 big political turnover, because this topic speaks about some fundamental elements, sovereignty, it's a fundamental element of state, it has also a great appeal at the populist level with public opinion. So I think people are sort of riding a wave. But, as I was saying earlier on, is that once the sort of the heat of the moment is gone and the dust is settled, I think that 2013 will probably be a very different year from the one we see. Maritime issues are not going to go away, because the maritime realm, and if you look at the way the strategy of the two countries evolved, it shows that much. It shows that the East China Sea matters for the two countries because of the economic survival, economic development, etc., etc. Access to resources as well as transportation of resources, as well as a platform for going anywhere else they want to go and have some sort of influence in a wider sense. So while the importance of the maritime sort of realm is not going to go away, I think that, unless someone does something very stupid, and I'll get back to this in a moment, I think that the question of the territorial disputes, the issue about the sovereignty, which is one of the many elements of these equations, would probably take a slightly less central place in the way the two countries negotiate. And there is a number of examples that I'm happy to talk about later. The last one being in 2001, in January, when people from the Ishigaki prefecture went to the Senkaku. The two governments seem to have controlled the escalation of the confrontation very much, very well, and definitely much better the way it evolved later on in the year. And the way it evolved later on in the year, I believe that had a lot more to do with Japanese domestic politics, read Ishihara's statement in April, as well as Chinese domestic politics, read the power transition and the fact that the government and the party cannot be seen as weak. Last but not least, what are the prospects for conflict and cooperation? Again, as I say, beyond the issue of the moment, or at least the current debate on the situation, this China Sea, because of its importance and because the importance of this maritime theatre is not going to go away, we will see this, and given also the evolution of the strategy and the approach to the two countries, I mean, the understanding within military and political elites of the wider economic and therefore strategic importance of this theatre, we can very likely see a comeback to discussions, exchanges about cooperative agreements in the way, for example, it was happening in 2008. This China Sea had, in the early years of the PRC, only represented a very limited strategic function. Today, this is no longer the case. It was a flank to protect and an area where the defeated nationalist forces had retreated, the risk of Taiwan going away. Today, really, this is no longer the case, and this China Sea is as important to China as it is to Japan. Indeed, for Japan, this China Sea is a question of survival, simply put, and the economic value and the importance to play to the positive aspects of the economic value of this theatre. It's something that is well understood in Japanese political and military elites for a very, very long time. So it's a realm for the transportation, trade. Both countries aspire to explore its resources. So there is a growing awareness that if you think about the attributes I was talking at the beginning, you know, the framework I used as a theatre where there's transportation, trade, as well as the possibility to access resources, you know, this complexity, this multi-layered existence of the theatre, this is the sort of awareness that is being expanded in both elites. There, in the complexities of this theatre, is where an opportunity exists for both countries to offset political disagreement. And this can happen because of the nature of the maritime environment, regardless of whether you settle the disputes today or tomorrow. As a matter of fact, you can't avoid, you know, shelving as they've done for the past 40 years and find some sort of an agreement. There's plenty of examples of that across history and more recent history. Take, for example, the way Australia settled matters with Indonesia. And by agreeing to give 90% of the resources, you know, sort of like access to the resources, but being the party that was processing most of these resources, so they got an economic advantage after all by just having sort of like jobs created in Australia with the processing of these resources. So there is where Japanese and Chinese authorities, in my view, can decide whether they want to, you know, the waves of this China Sea to separate them or eventually partly unite them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessio. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I told Alessio that we had a, let me get the mic. Sorry. I told Alessio we're an extremely dynamic crowd, which is why he had to be brief to allow our participants to ask lots of questions. So I hope I will not disappoint him. So speak now, hold your peace forever. Why don't we start there, Paul? They'll bring a mic.
I can't shout.
No, but
No, there's a microphone.
Yes. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Alessio, oh my God, that's quite loud.
Thank you.
Alessio, thank you. Hello? Okay? We okay? Okay. Alessio, thanks very much. Just looking at your lecture from an international relations theory point of view, I see exactly the same thing happening in cyberspace and space. Okay, so you have this sort of eruption of tension, second half of the Bush era. I'm going to get tied to the international political theory, you know, with domestic politics. You know, I'm sort of a reformed realist at the moment, but if you look at the Chinese ASAT, that's really pushing now a global consensus to try to come to a European European-led code of conduct. You've got Unkopoulos working now, and then in cyberspace after Estonia '97, and then particularly from the Chinese cyber attacks all over the place over the last few years, it seems that things have reached a kind of boiling point, and you're suggesting that maybe 2013, that we're going to see a change. So at the moment, you know, Chinese belligerency is being driven by internal politics, and that's somewhat of a reaction to what's happening. It's been driven by internal Chinese politics. But do you see a global trend in 2013? Because there are international norms in sea, cyberspace, and space coming, and it does seem to be sort of complex organisation, complex interactions are coming in. So do you see this as a sort of global trend? And then, if we have Mitt Romney as the next president, do you see another round of trouble coming in? Because I can see the sort of boiling point being reached in these three realms, but things have a chance of calming down. So, I mean, how do you see the scenarios playing out?
I must apologize in advance because you never ask to a historian a question about the future, because usually they get it wrong. So there's a good 98% that I'm going to get this one wrong. In principle, I wouldn't venture. I mean, I was torturing myself when I say that 2013 is going to be a better year. Really. Just because the type of crowd, I couldn't just come in and be, boring historian sort of thing. But your question, I think yes. In the maritime realm, I think UNCLOS is a very useful tool to begin with, but at the same time, UNCLOS was conceived and negotiated, and it was eventually, the result was a compromise, very much of a compromise. As a result of this, there are a number of ambiguities or a number of grey areas within UNCLOS, from how you define difference between an island or a rock. By the way, a rock is an island with less fabric, but still is an island. Which open up to interpretation. So there is these aspects. Most of the problems that we see, particularly, for example, in the South China Sea, is in a situation where there is a clear sort of imbalance in distribution of power between China on one hand and different countries from ASEAN. There are areas of ambiguity there in terms of UNCLOS is designed, and therefore there is an incentive, and this is why traditionally, for example, the Chinese always preferred to deal bilaterally with each country rather than multilaterally, because of the sort of the leeway that is inbuilt into the normative framework. So I think a big question is, can the normative framework be developed further? Of course it can, but then the same way UNCLOS was a process that was very much politicized and political and required a lot of negotiation, why shouldn't any other process of that kind be in the same way? In which case, then one of the key questions, insofar as China is concerned, is the role of the United States. The United States is, and the Chinese do accept it. I mean, when the Chinese write that the United States is a Pacific power by circumstances, basically what they're saying is that you're not, but you've been here for about 60 years, so we accept the fact that you're here. But that is not the case in South China Sea. And so, for example, this constant sort of attempt to be a sort of like a negotiator to broker some sort of agreement, I don't think that from China's point of view, this is necessarily an acceptable solution. So that's it. There is a substantial sort of like a basic framework or ground from where you can start building up additional blocks. But then the building up of those blocks is very much of a political thing, which brings back to the other component of the question, whether 2013 is going to be better. I have absolutely not the faintest idea of how a new president or a different type of president in the United States would behave. I mean, definitely, I can't possibly know. from what I read on the surface in the media, I mean, you know, it's a Republican campaign, played in a Republican way, you know. I mean, yeah, let's leave it to that, really. You know, in this respect, there are a number of issues, and I think perhaps one of the most important discussions and debates to have. You see, in the good old days, when the Cold War was around, the Soviet Union was around, in the second half of the 80s, when the Reagan administration, which by the way was the Republican administration, decided to go after, and they went out with the Maritime strategy. The Maritime strategy was a strategy where it had a strategic series of assumptions, and then it was operationalized in different ways in different theaters. At the moment, for the Pacific, other than the vague pivots thing, which now is called, it's not pivoting, re-engagement or rebalancing or something like that in Asia.
Pivot, refocusing now.
Refocusing, yes. Well, they change very, but from a strategic point of view, the best thing we got is the air sea battle, which is just in the title. It doesn't strike me to be very strategic. So I think again, because this is all about politics, at the same time, I'm still convinced that there is a wider degree of awareness within political and economic elites in this part of the world, as well as in the United States, about the potential benefits from cooperation. After all, there is an enormous amount of interdependence. Then, whether that is going to take priority over other components of the different administrations, unless you assume a single actor sort of approach, which I don't, then there are more options open onto the table, really.
Yes. Can we give you a microphone? If you can please introduce yourself as well. I think, here, first, second row.
So this one's not.
Okay, good.
According to your presentation, there are several of these.
If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Fukuhara. I'm a Japanese citizen. According to your presentation, there are several, a number of territorial disputes between the United States and China. What are they?
You know, that's a very good question. I haven't got the faintest clue because I didn't have time. I mean, I wanted to use it more for the sort of Japan, China, Korea, and other bits and pieces. But I didn't have time, literally, this morning to fully download the article. And so I have the same question you have. I have no idea. I wouldn't understand whether it is. What he meant was the number of instances where forces from the different sides were coming across each other, and I think that is perhaps the sort of spin they were giving. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't anything like a dispute in terms of territories.
One thing, I mean, I haven't read the article. There are disagreements about interpretations of what innocence passage means, what you can do in the EEZ. So they are, in that sense, they're not territorial disputes in the sense, I don't think there's any piece of land where the United States says it's American and China says it's Chinese.
Like
but they are very strong disagreements about what can be done and cannot be done in EEZ waters. So in that sense, that's very much a dispute.
I think they'll bring you the Siegfried and then maybe Rosa.
Siegfried, little freelancer from Germany. I missed that you didn't see the conflict between China and Japan on the background of a US-China rivalry. I think you didn't discuss so much about it, because I think if I would express in a drastic way, I would say so China sees Japan as a US aircraft carrier. So in this way, is it possible to discuss Japan-China rivalry without US-China rivalry?
I'm not talking about, I will never talk about China-Japan rivalry as it is, so that's why I'm talking about security relations. That's one point, and it's an important distinction to me. Second of all, thank you, that's a very good point, and it enables me to engage with that component. I think there's, while the two questions, or the China-US relations in the Pacific component of the story and the Japan-China relations are connected, I don't think they entirely overlap. So there is an important component on from an empirical point of view to keep them separated for the degree that it is possible. Unless you're assuming sort of a zero-sum context in which whatever it is gained at one end is lost at the other, and there is some sort of like path towards confrontation. And I'm not entirely convinced that that is something that should be assumed too easily. But at the very least, if we're assuming it, we should discuss it. So because tonight I was focusing on China and Japan, I focused less on that. Now, what is the role, or within the context of my discussion, how far the United States should be brought in? Well, first of all, the United States and Japan, of course, are related together by the US-Japan Security Alliance, and in a number of occasions, the United States confirmed the fact that the Senkaku Diaodao, they fall within Article 5. And I think that is a very important, point, because then it creates, it adds to the framework when we have another discussion, which is what are the possible scenarios in which a confrontation between Japan and China around the Senkaku would happen. In that context, I think what you're saying is absolutely essential. Why? Because unless we're assuming that the Chinese really are in for a fist fight with the United States, which I don't really think they are, really, so we should probably assume that any workable scenario insofar as the Senkaku are concerned is based on the assumption that you need to do something, if you want to do something, right, by making sure or trying to minimize the risk of an American intervention. And that reduces the number of scenarios. As a matter of fact, I don't think that, if the Chinese were to go in, all sort of invasion of the islands together, and by the way, relatively small, so it's sustaining people there. This is kind of an issue itself. I think the key element in the story is that that is not really something that would happen. On the other hand, what I can see as a potential possible scenario is some sort of like, special forces either parachuted or deployed by submarines, some commando operation, with the intention, though, to expose the Japanese government more than anything, and to make a point about the fact that that is Chinese sovereign territory. If the Japanese were to respond, on the other hand, and send GA time, I also believe that the Chinese wouldn't let things escalate any further than that, because by pulling out, if the Japanese were answering with full strength, they could always turn around and save face by saying, well, we didn't want the thing to escalate and have war with America, but we make a point, that is our territory, and we're going to get around at some point in the future. Other than that, I really cannot see any sort of plausible context in which, unless, again, as I said, you're assuming that the Chinese are in for a fist fight over the Senkaku Diaodao with the United States, which I really don't think. So in that sense, I'd say it is important to bring the United States into this specific conversation. Then I agree with you that for Japan, there's a number of questions to be addressed insofar as the person that stands in the middle between the United States and China. But that is a different kettle of fish and doesn't really pertain just to maritime dimension. Maritime dimension is just one component of it.
Yes.
I'm Hiroshi Meguro from Hosei University Institute of Okinawan Studies, and so I'm working on Okinawa, so I'm very curious about Chinese strategy, and particularly maritime security strategy. And my question is about the concept or mentality of PLA leadership. And some people say that army generals dominate the PLA. And so their kind of concept of security, even maritime security, is developed by the kind of way of thinking of army generals.
Yes.
And so occupy land and keep them as their bastions or whatever, and occupy islands, set them, keep them, as their bastions and so on and so forth. So do you think it's changing now? And that's a question.
This is the $1 million question. The whoever claims to have the answer for is just misled. I'll give you this answer. There is definitely an enormous debate in public forums as well as university. Many universities in China, especially in Beijing, they are developing, a strong cohort of research. I mean, I was in China just before coming here because of a cooperation based on the assumption that Peking University wanted a delegation because we do the naval stuff, okay, I would say. So we were there for a strategic studies seminar about navies and power transition, Falklands War, which oddly enough is a war about islands anyway, and other bits and pieces of this kind. So I think there is a movement, there is an enormous change ongoing in China about that component. There is a lot more of debating in the public arena. Now, I would also argue that from what I've seen so far, and over time, over the past few years, I engaged in more than one occasion with PLA, sort of components of the PLA from the National Defense University, National Defense and Technology University, the National Defense University, the Academy of Military Science, and as I was saying to some of the people that we were talking to earlier on, I was struck by the fact that, statistically, an overwhelming number of people in the research divisions of these places dealing with maritime things were army people. I found that quite interesting, especially because you're right. I mean, when you talk to people with that kind of background, sea power is intended either, is interesting because the basic assumption about sea power, right, in China seems to have two main meanings. One, which is about maritime strength, so like capabilities, and the second one, which is maritime rights, which has a lot to do in terms of applicability to the sort of like defining territories, ownership, and other bits and pieces. Whereas at sea, I would say sea power is a lot more than that. And to what extent there is a fully sort of embedded culture of this wider understanding of sea power, that I don't know. Because, and we go back to what I said at the beginning of this answer, it's very difficult at the moment to see how many people inside the decision-making process are involved and what kind of understanding they have. I'm pretty sure there are 2-3 professors between Peking University, Renmin University, Chushao University. They are quite influential, but I don't think even they don't know the extent to which they're influential into the policy-making process. And that's part of the answer. The second component of the answer is that, again, I don't assume China to be a single actor. As a matter of fact, over the past few years, the constabulary maritime agencies are getting more and more. And they have their own sort of like local academics, politicians, people in the economic sector they talk to argue their case. Now, of course, there's lots of money around in China these days, but still, you are in competition when you're talking about all of this. So, all I know is that there is an important debate. There is an evolving perception of the maritime realm, particularly of the South and the East China Sea. But to what extent there is an agreement on what exactly this meaning is, I don't think it's very much of an open question. Mind you, in this presentation, there's one very important missing component. If we're talking about Japan and China these days, you probably have to put this map here, right, together with another one that looks at the entire globe, or at the very least, to the extent, into the Indian Ocean, and then down to the Middle East and Africa. Because if we're talking about maritime strategy, I think that lists all the people I engage with, I would say that the Chinese military, as I said, people I'm engaged with, their concerns and preoccupation were more about, or in the order of priorities, I would say that the South China Sea is number 1, Indian Ocean, Western Africa number 2, Westpac number 3, and the East China Sea number 4, or roughly that kind of distribution. Westpac and also the bits that goes up here through the North Passage. Because you see, when that comes open, that will bring about quite an important geopolitical transformation insofar all the considerations and the importance of sea lanes, blah, 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 in years to come. So again, that suggests that there is a much wider debate with a growing and expanding. Now, who are those who take decision in regards to this particular aspect, and how do they think in relation to this expansion of intellectual thinking? That I can't really answer, I don't really know.
Any questions in the back? We've discriminated against the back.
There's one hand on the back over there. Yeah,
Sato-san in the middle, and then the gentleman in the last row. So.
Professor, my name is Sato, just an ordinary business person. Your introduction about from Temple mentioned your activity in China, that you are a research associate of the King's China Institute.
Yes.
That means a lot nowadays. It is highly valuable, because if you do this type of seminar to the Chinese people, the world may go forward to the peaceful one. What do you do in China?
You know, the funny thing about it is that as a Japan specialist, whenever I go to China, first problem I have to overcome the sort of basic perception that I must be, by definition, pro-Japanese. By definition. Yeah. Even before I start talking, it's like, you're a Japan specialist, right, so you must be anti-Chinese. Hey, you know, how you started talking? That's it. That's it. No, there is an important note to strike. I think you're absolutely right. There's a huge opportunity in trying to, especially if you're coming from Europe. If you're a European that works in Europe or in East Asia, first of all, you're a bit of a rat. You know, not that many people, especially people who work within the sort of like hardcore strategic studies arena. Okay, so you know you can talk a moment to talk about, I don't know, artillery ammunition. Even though I don't like too much artillery ammunition, but let's say, you know, naval gunfire support. Yeah. Big operations, and the moment after you start talking about Japanese or Chinese history, that's something very rare to come across, especially if you're coming from Europe. And that sets a very positive spin on the thing, in the sense that I suppose you're regarded as less threatening or less within a sort of an agenda, or political agenda. So in my experience, I was surprised every time I was in China, and every time I gave a seminar, either at the King's China Institute or within a context where primarily there was a Chinese audience, I'm always very tense, because you see, coming from Japanese studies, I'm worried that I might say something, you know, either go off with the Japanese term or use a Japanese term and forgetting the Chinese one. Thankfully, I've got Chinese students, so I always go to them, it's like, how do you pronounce this? Just to make sure. But I think the positive spin in this story is that in my experience, there is a lot of curiosity, a lot of willingness to engage, and a lot of interest in trying to listen to different sort of view. And I suppose, again, as I said, in my experience in China so far, I had very positive response. You know, and people will not hold their punches back. You know, they'll say, like, I vehemently disagree with you, and I'm happy, I welcome that, because this is how you try to make an improvement. But then, you know, whether that is going to be, it's going to have any sort of impact whatsoever, that's a different story. But I think you're absolutely right. Beyond the first initial perception to overcome, as someone who's trying to defend the Japanese position, partly because of the institutional affiliation and the background, after a while, it becomes then an important asset in that kind of engagement. And frankly, I'd say that I was impressed, especially this time around, where there was quite a good core of people from the PLA that attended the seminars. The type of of insightful, open sort of talk that we had during the seminar and afterwards, you know, reception and dinner. So, so perhaps for that reason, I try to be slightly more positive on this one. But thanks for the question.
Last row. Yes, here it is.
And there was someone.
Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Chris Padilla. I'm a major in the U.S. Air Force and a Mansfield Fellow, currently working in the Ministry of Japan Ministry of Defense. First, a couple of observations that I hope might reinforce some of the points you made based on some of the learning I've done over the past couple of weeks on Japan defense policy. First, I'll make a plug for a U.S. Air Force perspective in that any maritime activity is going to be dependent on airspace and cyberspace ops as well. So this is certainly a multi, 3, 4 plus dimensional approach to. But that aside, just the points you're making about the constabulary bureaus, the 5 dragons as you call them, is I think important from a perspective of possible escalation of events, because currently, based on what I understand, the Chinese Navy remains relatively detached from those territorial disputes. And if they were to get involved, that could be seen as an escalation of tensions between the two countries. And along those lines, again, your point about the politicization of the disputes, politicization of disputes. I've been speaking Japanese constantly for the past couple of days, so sorry. That's one of the concerns, is that if there's any type of internal turmoil in China itself that would cause more right-wing extremists to try and use these territorial disputes as a way to escalate, i.e. get the Chinese Navy involved in these disputes, that could be seen from a Japan defense perspective as a very hot-button issue. Finally, a question related to your expansion of the global perspective. I'm curious as to what you've gleaned as based on a Chinese defense or national security policy perspective on the current Japan self-defense force operations, anti-piracy operations out of the Horn of Africa, i.e. the fact that the Japanese government readily deployed SDF forces actually have a base there. Can that be viewed as a way that Japan kind of flexing a muscle, and that if we have any concern about freedom of the seas, especially in these geographically significant areas that are also very close to territories, is that sending a message to China that the self-defense force and the Japanese government wouldn't hesitate to leverage that?
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for this is a very, very important point. Thank you so much for bringing them out. But first of all, I really had no intention to keep the Air Force out of the equation. But you also have to, to forgive me. I come from a country where whoever talks naval stuff has a serious fundamental problem. Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. What's the Royal Navy's biggest enemy? Royal Air Force, not the German Navy. Everybody knows that, and it goes a long way back. Since the Royal Air Force snitched literally the best pilots after World War I, and reduced the whole Fleet Air Arm into a sort of left it in a difficult situation. But no, absolutely, in this part of the world, especially I would say modern armed forces that are extremely interconnected. Therefore, the tridimensional nature of the battle space is something that one should always take into consideration, especially when we look at the so-called anti-access area denial capabilities that the Chinese are investing in. That's definitely something that brings the problem of air forces and the use of space in particular back into the equation. So that's a very important point, and thanks for bringing that up. The 5 dragons. I completely agree with you. I think there is a consensus, at least here in Japan, about how far. Well, first of all, I completely agree also with your assessment. I mean, my experience, the PLAN and the PLA in general are the most cautious when it comes down to these issues of territorial ownership. And again, if we collect it back, we sort of we tied it up with what I was saying at the beginning, that the so-called good order at sea, the component of sea power that deals with the management of the maritime realm, is very much of the newest branch. This is something that is fully being developed at the moment. It's not an established, so it's not like a sea control or power projection whereby we've got all sorts of definitions possible and imaginable. Because the normative framework that was mentioned earlier on, it's so still in the process of being created to a degree, and it has these grey areas. And of course, insofar as the territorial disputes are concerned, the PLA is by far, my impression is exactly the same. It's very, very cautious. And they kind of step back. In fact, they never entered the Chinese territorial waters unless I think it happened only one time in 2004 when the Chinese submarine washed out off the coast of Okinawa in the Ryukyus. Otherwise, what they do is they're transiting through the Japanese straits with international waters in between when they go to exercise at sea. That's a very different type of thing. And in fact, one thing that really, really I find misleading is when the media brings everything together. And they don't give any specification about, I'm sorry, I have nothing against people in the media, I mean, I love them. But, you know, let's say summary reports, when they say like, oh, the Chinese Navy was sent to patrol the Senkaku Islands. No, they weren't. Mind you, in Europe the problem is that this type of news rarely comes on the front page, so you try to bring a bit of a sensational element to it. How much now, because of that, I don't know if, well, first of all, there's a component of the PLA assessing the self-defense forces. I think they're very wary of the fact that if we assume that they would consider scenarios where the United States is not brought into the equations, I think part of the reasons why the PLA is very careful about all sorts of things is that I think they know the quality at the operational and tactical level and in terms of also platforms and capabilities that the Japanese possess. It might be that this balance 10 years, 15 years down the road will change. That is a different type of question that we can, discussion we can have. But I think at the moment, they're very wary of any serious move also because of that. On the other hand, I think there is a problem in terms of trying to get an understanding of the degree to which the maritime agencies are fully under the same sort of tight control that ties together the PLA with the Chinese Communist Party. After all, the PLA is the People's Liberation Army. It's not a national army, it's the party's police force, first and foremost. Whereas these organizations, they come from state organizations that have also a stake in trying to show that they're more relevant. I mean, the CMS, which is now sending patrol ships in the Senkaku, nobody had heard of them 7-8 years ago. They were getting second-hand PLAN ships. That's really not cool. In no possible way, regardless of how you put it. So, in this respect, the degree to which these organizations and their relationship with the party, and in a context where there is a political development in China, where even within the party and between the PLA and the party, there's different political groups and alignments. Therefore, there's sort of like open field on how this transition will pan out in the end. The degree to which there is a full 100% control over these small organizations, I think it's still very much an open question. And that is perhaps the single most dangerous component in this entire story. Because whereas at sea you can always pull back and sort of like, de-escalate something. At the same time, the behavior of these actors can lead to unexpected, uncontrolled sort of situations. On top of that, I would say in the same category, one should put also the activists. Again, if you're the PLAN, you have a sort of a clear command structure. Yes, you're going to do some buzzing around with the helicopters and other bits and pieces, but who hasn't done? Right? Soviet Union was doing it all the time. You can't control, activists going around doing that. So that is also, I would put into this sort of, in this pot of the elements that could provide a destabilizing, or could prove to be a destabilizing factor.
Ambassador Numata? And then we're going to bring you the mic.
There was another question here.
Yeah,
Well, Sadaki Numata, retired diplomat. You've given me so many things to think about, so I'm trying to see in my own mind if I can simplify the picture a little.
Okay.
To do that, I focus on three things.
Okay.
The first three factors you mentioned, resource, political influence, and communication.
Yes.
Secondly, the number of incidents that China has been involved in. Philippines tops the list, Japan comes second, Vietnam third, as I remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the second point. The third point is the priorities that you mentioned with, in the Chinese mind.
Yes.
You mentioned South China Sea, Indian Ocean, and Western Pacific.
Western Africa, Western Pacific.
Yes. Now, I'm inclined to feel that the Chinese communist leadership is most interested in keeping their people alive.
Yes.
To secure their livelihood.
Yes.
Which does seem to indicate that resource is a very important motivation. So what I'm trying to ask is, how do you put these three things together? Would they be interested, for example, more in the Philippines than in Senkaku? That's one way of putting it.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and thanks for raising this. Can I just say, why everybody wants to know about China? Why nobody ask about, Japan? What's Japan side in this story? It's unbelievable. I mean, I go to China and people ask about China. I come to Japan and people ask about China. I mean, where do I have to go to have people ask me about China? I don't know. Korea. I should go to Korea. Next time we're doing the seminar in Korea, frankly.
We'll do it on top.
No, exactly. Exactly. Let's do something, No, right, okay. Yes, true, and I think if you allow me the expression, one of the fundamental components of the social contract in China that ties the government and the party with the Chinese people, and that's a big oversimplification because that China is very different things depending on the place you are. I would say is based on the assumption that there is an element of legitimacy that is granted by the fact that economic growth is being the trend and is the one that basically underpins some sort of the social contract. You stay there, we accept the system, and we believe this system works because you're providing us with that. In the process, however, I think that there is a little bit also of a dilemma or a contradiction, in the sense that the Communist Party and the government, they don't want to look weak at the same time. So insofar as the territorial disputes, well, I completely agree with you, they have all the interest to try to exploit the cooperative element of what I was talking about. Communication. Chinese sea lanes and Japanese sea lanes and Korean sea lanes, they overlap because there's just so many, places you can get a ship going about. Simple as that. So there is an element there. All these countries are interested in securing or in maritime security in a positive sense because they all depend upon it, right? So, and that's why I was trying to say that even in terms of accessing resources, protecting sort of wider interests, there are elements of cooperation that one can build upon. And again, going back to some of the agreements in 2008 that I was mentioning, this China Sea, and the activities for the code of conduct in 2002, and then the joint exploration that were into the agreements of 2005 for the Joint Research Center for the exploration in the South China Sea. Again, these are all elements that go back to this very simple equation that you mentioned, right? Resources, economy, the livelihood of people. I completely agree. At the same time, I think in China, perhaps the dilemma is that the government is now so much deeply sort of like bound to its narrative. Keep us here and we'll keep you, feeding you and making you rich and bring you to a different place. They are some sort of like in an awkward position when they show any sort of weakness in regards to issues that have very little to do with economy, but have to do with history, legacy, and we also, the sort of like the party, legitimize its narrative. Keep us here because that's where we're going to move away from a sad past of conquest, a past of suffering, and therefore, we're not going to allow that to happen. In the process, if you go a country like the Philippines or a country like Japan, or eventually even with Korea, they've got a bit of trouble from time to time. But territorial disputes come across, and again,
in a year of political transition, in a situation where there's different elements, party, outside party. Tell you something else. From my point of view, in the South China Sea, if you look at the Gulf of Tonkin and the way, for example, the Chinese national offshore oil company is being very, very aggressive, I'm not entirely sure that the government was full behind the kind of aggressive posture. I think that economic profit has a lot to do and there's a lot to say with the behavior of the offshore company, even though 40% of the board is composed by people from the government. But at the same time, if they see an opportunity and they can, take economic advantage, right? You can always turn around and say to whoever is in government or the party, by the way, you want to keep your narrative going, then we're going there. At that point, the party has to show a certain control, a certain sort of it has to be seen as strong. So what I'm saying here is that because of this element, I absolutely agree with you that the element of economic development and sort of strengthening from an economic point of view is a core element of the wider national narrative. I think that doesn't come cost-free, and the sort of complementary elements to that narrative create situation of contradiction or at least problematic for the government itself. Thank you.
Okay, it's not a democracy.
I know. We've unfortunately reached almost the end of our session. So I'm sorry we couldn't accommodate all the questions, but unfortunately we can't run sessions until midnight. I think maybe I'll give you because we really only have a few minutes to conclude and maybe make a few final statements.
I mean, if we prefer a little bit of flexibility in the
okay, we do. So we had two. Okay, so we had Martin in the back,
someone in the middle there,
and Umza in the middle. But just a kind of one-sentence question, and then Alessio will summarize his findings. And you had a question too.
Martin Kolleg, journalist from Germany. My question is are there basically do you think that China or Japan misperceives the intentions of the other?
Okay.
And Umza?
Hi, you mentioned that in the scenario if the Chinese were to do a commando mission to the Senkakus, then the Jietai, the Kaijo Jietai would respond. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's not enough political leadership. I don't think there's enough political decisiveness on the Japanese side. So if you could speak a little bit about the Japanese political situation in terms of responding to maritime contingencies, that would be great. Thank you.
And we thank Humza for asking a question about Japan.
No, really, I mean, that is a really...
And we welcome Humza back to Tokyo. He's been a very good friend of TUJ, and we're very happy to have him back in Japan.
Right, there was hold on, there was one, you had a question for a very long time. In the middle, the gentleman in the middle. You don't have it anymore. No. Okay. So I'll take just this last one. Okay. Yes.
What's the best way to diffuse the current tension over the purchase of the island?
Oh God. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's right. Well, thanks for the questions. Now, I'll start with the one that is very simple. The one concerning the Japanese. I didn't say that the Jietai would intervene. The Jietai, without mandate from civilian authority, go nowhere. That's an important point. I didn't say that. I say that would force the Japanese government to make some sort of response, which could be sending Jietai or not sending Jietai. But I agree with you that if they don't send anybody, which is not unlikely, provided the sort of the current state of Japanese politics, they will make a mockery of everything else they're trying to, any other type of statement they're trying to make. So that I think that's why that scenario is slightly more likely than others. Because it would put the ball on the Japanese side of the fence in a situation where there is a substantial sort of political leadership crisis at the moment. I mean, thank God the good days when Koizumi was around. He wasn't a man of vision, but definitely was that guy that on the spot he would take a decision, do something about it. Now, there are many other things that can be said about the man, but in that respect it was sort of different. I didn't think, and that is the issue, insofar as it's concerned. If we talk about risks, I think the risks are whatever sort of like accidental, you know, whether there's someone who's just swimming to get ashore and drowns, or you've got the patrol, the occasional patrol boat that runs into the Japanese Coast Guard cutter, or you've got a situation where effectively there is an action taken by the Chinese with intent to prompt a response and the Japanese do nothing about it. I think these are perhaps the key sort of places where one would find some sort of degree of risk intended as an event that would prompt then a change into the current sort of overall status quo. Which brings me to the last question. I think in the 70s and the 80s, the best option was the one of shelving the issue. Mind you, in 72 and 78, it was the Japanese side that brought it up. The Chinese were very happy to, you know, drop it. Zhou Enlai made it clear, Deng Xiaoping made it clear, and the Japanese government went back and said, oh, you know, let's talk about it a second. So it didn't help their case. And I think part of it was that because the Chinese are also of the opinion that we don't have to settle this now because we're not strong enough to make whatever it is that is necessary to be made. Let's wait and see. In the meantime, however, I think that from an economic point of view, there are all sorts of incentives for creating a degree of cooperation that would just make it a lot easier to come to any sort of discussions about settling territorial disputes at a later stage. And it is also for this reason that, as I said, I'm convinced that in a year of substantial political changes across the region, we'll have to wait and see next year if a different sort of phase will dawn. And I think eventually it will. On a very positive spin, yeah? We'll take the next discussion to Korea. Hoo-ha. And thank you very much for coming.